We are talking about the text and canon of the New Testament. And by that we mean, how do we know what the text is supposed to be? We have these 27 documents that make it up. How do we know that the text that is in the copies we have now is essentially identical to what was first written, especially when we don't have the originals or the autographs anymore? But then the second question is, why these 27 and not others, either in addition to it or instead of some of them? And those are two different subjects, and yet they very much go together. And the reason we cover it is because this is the very foundation of our faith, isn't it? If we don't have real confidence that what we have is what they wrote, and if we don't have real confidence that substantially everything that was intended, as far as can be humanly possibly determined, is in it and nothing else, then we also have a religion of doubt, not of faith. Or we go over to what many of the skeptics already accuse us of believing in spite of the evidence, or in the absence of the evidence. But it's neither of those things. We have the evidence, and the evidence overwhelmingly, I believe, points in a certain direction. The skeptics tends to pick at certain things, sometimes maybe taking it even out of context, but other times even in the context, not pointing out that there are other things that weigh into the equation as well. Like I was just reading, I guess again last night, a skeptic, actually he claims to be an atheist, is writing about what's the big deal about Christians claiming to have so many Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. He said the vast majority of them are over 1,000 years later than when the event supposedly happened. So that's no good. But he just makes that assertion. He doesn't show why he believes that's true, or how does he balance that out with the fact that almost every document or set of documents from the ancient world is in a far worse situation than the New Testament is, and yet he no doubt has no problem with Julius Caesar or any number of Alexander the Great, and yet we have almost no documentation concerning those people. But get any textbook, it seems like the authors of those textbooks have no trouble at all believing it's all true. And yet we have, multiples more of documents closer to the events, as well as those 1,000 years later, backing up the New Testament, and suddenly they have a problem with that. That's not a level playing field. And I understand that's the way the skeptic will be, and we just accept that instead of just complaining about it. Even when it's not a level playing field, we still come out to the good. I'm convinced of that. All right, so let's see if I can find where I got down to in terms of I think it was about right there, isn't it? That's where we closed last time, about objections answered. For this subject of study, the discovery of thousands of Greek manuscripts, a few dating all the way back into the 2nd century, which means the 100s, and then more and more as we move into the later centuries after that are all copies of earlier ones, which at some point were copies of the original or the autographs. That's not in dispute. Again, as I just mentioned, the atheist, he complains about us making a big deal about having so many of them. That's the interpretation of the facts. He doesn't argue with the facts. He just argues about what do you make of it. And I think for many reasonable people, that they will say that's sufficient, because we do that in all other areas of life. If you often consider how we take, even today, documents almost on their face value, legal documents, wills, contracts, all sorts of things we take basically on their face value unless we have some real reason to not do so. A standard that's been in the court systems, at least in the United States, almost since the establishment of our court systems, is that documents presented into evidence should be accepted at face value unless there's some evidence that would call them into question. There was a book written, I guess maybe in the 1850s, called The Testimony of the Evangelist. Well, that's an old book by now, 160, 175 years old. The author, Simon Greenleaf, is worthy of note because he founded the Harvard Law School and was considered one of the most outstanding jurists of his generation. And his studies and writing concerning what constitutes acceptable evidence in a court of law is still at least referred to in modern law schools. And many of the texts they use today about evidence are built upon what he taught and what he wrote about. Well, he wrote a book about the testimony of the evangelist. In other words, the gospel writers. Now, he wasn't talking about particularly what's the Greek manuscript evidence to back them up. But one part of his book does address that. And he talks about, can we accept these documents as not inspired, that wasn't the question, not God's revelation, but as acceptably accurate records of history. And he said, according to the laws of the court, they're acceptable. And then when we open them up, based upon the fact that we, even as we might say, well, there might be some mistakes in there, we don't think so, but in some documents that are presented in court, there might be some factual errors presented, but that doesn't negate the whole document. And so then he begins to talk about what's in these documents. It's a great read. It's probably in print somewhere at this time, or if not, online that you can download. It's called The Testimony of the Evangelist by Simon Greenleaf. And so that's what we're looking at here. The facts that these documents exist is not in question. But we did point out, and we'll continue to do that you have to be careful, either yourself or in those who are either defending or opposing the proposition we're looking at, that these are reliable historical documents. You have to be careful of these things that really do not add properly to the discussion, using implications without stating outright what you really mean. And the example I gave is still a valid one from last time, that Mr. Ehrman or Dr. Ehrman will say, well, in the New Testament documents that exist today, there's over 400,000 errors. First of all, not all scholars agree that number is accurate. That's the highest end I've ever seen. But even the numbers that are being used, 280,000 or 300,000 plus, it's still sounds like a significant number. And then he'll say, when there's only 138,000 words in the whole New Testament as it's being printed today. And then he just sort of drops it. Like there's at least, that works out to about 3 errors for every word. But that's an innuendo. That's not the whole picture of what's going on. That's taking those 5,700, now 5,833 I heard yesterday, New Testament Greek documents from the very earliest fragment we have around AD 125 going all the way up to one around 1400 AD. That's counting all the errors between them and then compiling those. The other part of it is what type of errors. the kind of errors that are easily identifiable and can be dismissed simply as simple human error that we all still make today. I haven't started reading your papers yet, but I hope after you typed yours, you proofread it. Because if you didn't, I will get to do some textual criticism too. I from time to time write an article for our church bulletin, write other things. I have to go back and proof those. I don't know how many times, even on my phone. I picked up and texted somebody right quick and hit send, then look, oh no, what did I just do? I didn't practice some good textual criticism even before I sent that text message to somebody. The wrong word, or misspelled word, a word left out, doubled a word, used it twice in a row. That's part of the rest of the story as well of this, quote, 400,000, is that some 80% of them, I've even seen some scholars say 90% of these 400,000 errors are simple errors like that are easily recognizable and do not change the meaning of the text. Double words, misspelled words, double up even sometime on a letter when the word is only supposed to have one particular letter in it. One time they have it twice in a row. It's just a form of misspelling. And all sorts of other things like that. Okay, yes, Mr. Solis.
Are you familiar with any of the errors they say that there are in the Bible? Can you give us an example of any? The ones that they say that they have?
Okay. Realize, first of all, that about 80 to 90% are all in this area here. And while he says 400,000, 80 to 90% of those 400,000 are these kind of errors. But he wants to imply, using innuendo, that almost all that 400,000 are actually very serious, doctrine-changing, understanding the history-changing kind of errors there. And that's not the case. By the time they get down to the bottom line, even other critics like him, and even he in some of his scholarly stuff he's put out, basically say that no more than maybe 1% or 2% of all the errors between different, and again, they just mean differences between one document and other documents you lay alongside of each other, would even have any effect at all on any understanding of the Scripture, either doctrinally or historically or practice. So, and there's even stuff out there to help that. Now, this is a little bit older volume here. Someone asked me that I bring the same Bible I did last time, and I left that. My box gets full before I can put everything in there. But I bought a different one for you today. It says the New Testament on it. But when you open it up, what you find is something that goes by two terms, and they mean slightly different things. First of all, we have the critical text here. A critical text, just like criticism, textual criticism, is another word that's used in a very specific sense in this science of study. We don't like the word criticism normally, do we? We think someone's demeaning us, making fun of us, talking about some mistake or error we've made, or something like that. When they talk about textual criticism, they mean looking at the text critically. But again, that word critically doesn't mean with an eye to find mistakes, though certainly they want to spot those if they're there, but with a careful eye to try to make sure they are finding and seeing everything they need to find and see. So that's how they use the term critical. And so this is, first of all, a critical text because they've taken all the major manuscripts, and as you can't see from as far away as you are, I know, but we have the Greek New Testament here, and then you have one of the English translations right next to it. I even forget which one now they're using, the English translation. But then at the bottom you have all these what amounts to footnotes. And by every single word in the Greek where there's a significant difference between the manuscripts, that's noted in the footnotes. And so this is called a critical text. Like I say, this is a little bit older one. The newer versions are constantly adding to this. This one's probably 20, 30 years old, so they've changed it and improved it even more since then. So it's a critical text, but it's also what's called an eclectic text. E-C-L-E-C-T-I-C, eclectic. Do you know what eclectic in the general vocabulary means? It means basically a mixture, a diversity brought together. And what the Greek text is here is, even though they're noting changes between other manuscripts, this Greek they're using is not one manuscript that looks just like this. This is taking the best scholarship they have right now and considering all those differences, what Ehrman wants to call errors, one and all. Many of them are just differences. And then trying to determine what is either clearly the correct one, because if you have like 400 manuscripts that all read exactly one way in one place, and you have 1 or 2 or 10, all that came from one certain area within a very limited time frame of each other that have it differently, you can almost say conclusively those 10 are mistaken. That somehow an error got introduced with one document, and then as other copies were made of that one document with an error in it, it just got repeated. And so there's those kind, but then there are other changes too. And so this is an eclectic text. It's one that no one manuscript looks just like this. It's the best they know right now about what, as they're trying to restore something as close as possible to the autographs, if that makes sense to you. And you may want to look at this during the break just to get a sense of that. It got a lot of the apparatus they use, how they designate things and show things and so forth. Well, but to not, and I realize you can't always say everything you know, but to just leave stuff hanging out there with seemingly for the very purpose of implying something that almost no one in the scholar community believes, but that's what you want the general public to believe, is not right. And we shouldn't be practicing that either. For example, we shouldn't say, well, there's no problems here. That's not right either. Don't worry about it. That implies there's not a problem here. That's an innuendo. And we don't want to do that either. Nor do we want to try to confuse someone, try to say it as simply and fully as we can, that here's the real situation. We don't have the originals. We've got all these copies. If we compare all the copies, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, it becomes obvious almost immediately what the correct thing should be. Only in a very small percentage of the cases is a real question about some of these things. And then the scholars can look at those closely, and then they will, as they have done in this one here, or they've done in whatever translation you're using, almost surely, they will finally give you the English translation of the text they chose, but they'll have footnotes that says some texts say, and they'll tell you what the alternative is even there. They're trying to make sure that we still don't miss it, even if either one of those two. Or I know I use a 1984 NIV still. I know a few passages where in the footnotes they'll not only say some have this, they'll even say and some others have this. So you got three alternatives. The one they chose for the text, thinking that's the most likely. But here's two other possibles about those things that did have some significance. So innuendo doesn't serve any good thing. Another one is talking about one possible explanation of why something is the way it is, but then after a little while you're talking about it as if that's the only possible explanation, when it's not the only possible. We see that in all sorts of areas of life. Years ago, when Richard Rogers was still alive, he used to teach a class. I don't remember if it was a whole term or just back when we used to have 2-day seminars. We would use some of the break weeks to offer 2-day seminars for students to take. He would teach a class on logic. And one of the big problems of logic is drawing conclusions that are not warranted by the argument you're making. And once you've drawn that conclusion that isn't warranted, and then using it as the basis for your next argument when it doesn't hold water. And yet that often happens, that people will... I didn't save any text out here, but I'm reading some things, both those who think like we do and those on the other side who will say, you'll see words like probably or most likely as they're talking about this. They'll say most likely this is the case, probably we think that this is what happened. But if you keep reading the article, pretty soon the probablys and most likelies have disappeared. And now they're using those earlier probablys and most likelies as if they're concrete facts now that we can build the rest of our discussion on. And that's not good, no matter what you think about something. And that goes to the next one, just stating an opinion or your bias about something as if it were fact, without at least acknowledging that there are others that think differently and there might be other ways to think about this, but I'm overwhelmingly convinced that this is true. And then, of course, as all of us tend to do, we just pick the facts or the scholars that seem to agree with us and don't even acknowledge the others even exist, much less that there might be others who hold a different point of view on it. And that's just not a good way to approach study. Okay. I want to spend a few minutes to talk to you about what I call surrounding evidences. By surrounding evidences, one of the major things that the critics are arguing about the New Testament, if we went back to a couple of slides and saw it, is they argue that what we have is not what they wrote, but I think what they really mean is what the documents we have are telling us is the history and or the practice of the first church is not what we're reading now. In other words, that's where they really want to get down to. That's seldom said in just those words, but that's really where they want to go. The documents we read talk about the miracles of Jesus. Some of them will argue that if we had the original documents, if they were written by eyewitnesses, the miracles would not be listed. They would argue if we do have eyewitness testimony in the autographs, what we have now with the resurrection included was not there originally. That's a real argument. Because they'll go on to say all these things were added by later people who, while they were copying, were also editing and amending, adding to the text. As if they basically picture a grand conspiracy that somehow ancient peoples who lived all the way around the Mediterranean with no internet, no telephones, not even a decent mail system, somehow could carefully coordinate the changing of the text they all had so that everywhere in every place it essentially looked the same, just ignoring the misspelled words and all those errors. But somehow, in spite of the errors, they managed to get it right on changing the real facts of the case everywhere. Does that make sense? Is that a possibility?
Do they have anything to support that argument?
Well, usually when you're writing a book for popular consumption, you don't have to. If you just say it long enough and loud enough and say you and one other guy with 2 PhDs after his name says it, so some people's going to believe it. And even the ones that don't believe it have a seed of doubt sown in their mind because they most likely either will not or do not actually go double check it and see if this is what everybody's thinking. We're such a culture now that's driven by the instant, what's the latest and greatest thing that's out there, the latest controversy, the latest problem going on in Washington, the latest thing that the president did or didn't do. I'm a bit amazed over the last few days, and now it's already dying down because he's passed his first 100 days. They talked about what is Trump, first of all, what is Trump going to do in his first 100 days? And then for the next 100 days, what do we have the news filled with? Every executive order he signs, a judge throws it out. Every thing he asks Congress to pass, they don't pass. Then when we get up to 100 days, they says, Trump has the lowest rating of any president in recent history of doing what he said he would do. What's the problem with that? I mean, I didn't vote for the guy either. But I think I can see the problem with that kind of argument. It's not that he didn't try. He did what he had the power to do. He's not either the judicial or the legislative branch of our government. He's the executive branch. And he, just like before him, President Obama, did as much as he could to advance the causes he believed in. But he can't make the judges and he can't make the legislators do necessarily what he wants done. And so, we just have to realize that. We live in this kind of a media frenzy type world today. The ancient world was not so much like that because they couldn't get the news out so quickly and so easily everywhere. But still, the argument is that it's not until... originally, the argument was it wasn't until around 8200 that people actually believed Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, that argument has disappeared. You know why? Because they found earlier manuscripts that talk about it. So that sort of negates that, doesn't it? They just moved it back a little bit. Now they'll say nobody before AD 140 believed it or whatever. But is the only thing we have to know what they believed from the very beginning, is the only thing we have just the manuscripts? The answer is no. So even if we don't have the manuscripts from before AD 100, either the original autographs or the very earliest copies, is there anything else that might tell us what they believe that either confirms or disagrees with the copies of the manuscripts we do have? And the answer is yes. I've just listed a few of them here, just sort of a reminder to you. First of all is the early secular sources concerning Jesus and Christianity. Y'all have all had historical Christian evidences already. Did Brother Ed teach that again this? I thought that finally he has retired from doing that. But nevertheless, in his material, and I'm sure in the material you were presented with as well, they talk about some of the secular sources dated in the first century that mention or talk about in one way or another the existence of Jesus and some of the fundamental facts concerning him. Now, that's not possible if people didn't yet believe those things. I realize in and of itself it doesn't prove they're true, but it does prove that people already in the first century was believing that. And so then the argument that the documents didn't represent that as well, because we have only later ones, and claiming somebody inserted in later doesn't seem to hold up. And so those kind of arguments don't seem to hold water. But it's not just Jesus himself, it's what did the Christians believe? Did they talk to you about a letter that was written by a governor of Bithynia, Pliny the Younger, around AD 112, writing to the Emperor Trajan? Yep. And of course, look at some of the things he was saying in that. He talks about they meet on a certain day. Now, he doesn't mention what day it is, but he says there's just one certain day they're always meeting on. And they sing hymns to Christ, this person Christ, as if he were God. What is that saying? That at least in his neck of the woods, by AD 112, Christians believed Jesus was divine. And he's looking at it from an outsider. I doubt he ever actually attended a service of the early Christians. He probably had, as he goes on to say in part of his letter later, that he actually took two women slaves who were a part of that Christian community there and tortured them until they told him what he wanted to know about what they did. Torture is not actually the best way to find out the real truth from people, but Sometimes when you torture people, they'll tell you whatever you want to hear. But anyway, so already we're seeing not only were they already in existence there, but they were a couple of fundamental things. That certain day, I think it's safe to believe, but it's just my opinion, that probably was Sunday. It goes on to say they would come back together and eat together. And they would all take a vow to treat other people correctly and to live up to the standards, basically, that their teacher had taught them about telling the truth, being honest, don't cheat people, don't steal, don't murder, all of that. All those things are corroborating evidence that even without an AD 112 Greek manuscript talking about what Christians did in the book of Acts, that in AD 112 they were still doing that. So these early secular sources, and some of the very early Christian practices we know, that what we just mentioned there is part of it, but there's a lot of other things that document what Christians did from the very beginning, and I'm sort of run some of these together here. They already, before the first century was out, had already identified some sites in what we now call the Holy Land as sacred. There's enough evidence even to convince most skeptical scholars that they were already visiting the tomb where Jesus had been buried and they believe rose from the dead. They were already visiting that as a special site long before the end of the first century. And so right at the beginning of the second century, the Roman emperor at that time, in order to put a stop to this, actually had the whole area leveled down, filled in, built in a big platform on top of it, and he builds a huge temple to a pagan god on top of it. Why there? It was not the most convenient place to build it. It was actually outside the city walls, as, by the way, the gospel said it was. But he was trying to bury a belief by burying this place where they went. Have I mentioned to you about Peter's house up in Capernaum? Did I mention that earlier? I think we did. That there, when even today, within the last 50 years, starting in 1961, I think, when they suddenly discovered it's underneath this building that dates from around 500 AD. Underneath that building, they found another one that dated from about 300 AD, and inside of that, they found a house, the ruins of a house. The original wall still standing. Now they've removed most of those two buildings that were over the top of it and built an even bigger one over the top of it now. But it's on stilts over it, glass floor, and on the walls of this house in Capernaum, there's lots of inscriptions from the first century written on the wall, sort of, like we sometimes see graffiti today. But they seem to be a little bit more organized than that, recognizing not only that this is where Peter lived, but this is the place where those Christians in the first century worshipped Christ even before the first century was over. That's kind of corroborating evidence that people already were believing that Jesus was something very, very special. It even puts a lie to a book that just came out just a few years ago called Zealot. I can't remember the rest of the title, but a guy named Ezra Aslan or something like that wrote it. And it's where he puts forth this idea that Jesus was really just a typical political revolutionary. And he was one of many that were opposing the Romans leading up to the final destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But after all that went bad, that later followers of his changed the story after AD 70 and turned him into a spiritual Messiah instead of a political one. But that doesn't hold water based on the evidence. And his was a bestseller book for about 3 weeks, and then everybody that bought it read it or didn't, and they move on to the next sensational thing that may or may not be true. But Also have to explain, how did Christianity spread so quickly? And everyone, even the critics, admit this, that very quickly Christianity spread all the way around the Mediterranean. From as one guy called it, the armpit of the Roman Empire, Judea, the most problematic place in all the Roman Empire in the first century was Judea. Rome had more trouble with it than anywhere else. And yet out of this place, a guy no one had ever heard of, who was a part of a religion that most of the people who had heard of Judaism or who knew someone was Jewish considered them antisocial and didn't fit in with the rest of society wherever they were around the Roman Empire. And yet out of this comes a fellow and then disciples of his who are able to carry his message all the way around the Roman Empire, so that by the end of the first century, there are congregations of Christians in almost every city and town and village in the entire Roman Empire. How did they convince so many people that this was true when, by the telling of modern skeptics, it so obviously wasn't? That doesn't hold water. That's not how things work. And so they spread it. And the fact that the manuscripts, when we finally do start finding manuscripts, we're finding them everywhere. We're finding them in the deserts of Egypt. We're finding them in the catacombs of Rome. We're finding them in caves in Cappadocia. They're everywhere. And yes, while there's differences between them, there is an overwhelming, amazingly amount of identicalness about them. They're all talking about the same thing. And of course, what is always true of history, no matter what somebody tries to do, you sometimes hear people say, well, the winners write the histories. They try to. But the further time goes along, they have no control either over what story gets out or what survives. These early Christians were not concerned about preserving the autographs. They were concerned with making as many good copies as they could, to getting it to every Christian community, as more and more of them were springing up all the time, so they could all actually have not just an oral teaching, but a written teaching of the truth of what they believed. And so there's a large amount of circumstantial and corroborating evidences from the first century period that help us to realize that what the earliest copies of the manuscripts we have now are saying is what people in the first century who were Christians did actually believe. And it seems to me to be nonsense and a non-starter to start suggesting that somewhere between the first copies we have and the originals as they were written, some kind of massive revision took place. So that every manuscript after that point in time, when the first ones started showing up, and they have no way of knowing when we would get the first ones, here 2,000 years later or 1,900 years later, that everywhere we find the manuscripts, whether it's in the Oxyrhynchus digs in Egypt or whether it's in Gaul or wherever it is, that they would all read the same way and every one of them would be a lie. And these are people who at any moment found their life on the line for what they believed, because they were still an illegal religion in Rome. And so about every 20 years, Rome decides to persecute them again. And yet the overwhelming majority of them would die rather than deny what they believed. And it's oddly enough, in all the records that have survived, and they're fragmentary, of these persecutions, I've never yet read of one where the Roman authorities said, aha, we finally found the guy who propagated the lie. He admits he's the one that changed the document. And then convinced everybody else that the lie he put in was the truth. That's never seen. They were all convinced it was the truth, and they were willing to die for it. And again, just because someone will die for something doesn't mean it is the truth, but I suspect that when people are willing to, not only willing, but do die for something, it's because they are 100% convinced it is the truth. And more than just the truth, that it's that it's better to die for it than to live denying it. So there's just a few of the surrounding evidences. Now, about finding the manuscripts, and that's, again, something to realize. While we talk about 5,700 or 5,833 or whatever the latest number is of Greek manuscripts, we freely acknowledge that the majority of them are dated later. The earliest ones are few and far between. But again, that's not something that's any different than it is for almost any other ancient manuscripts, if we have any copies of them at all. In fragmentary histories and writings of others that have managed to survive by one means or another, outside of the whole idea of Christianity, there's often references to someone else's book or someone else's history that they wrote. That's the only evidence we even have that ever existed, is somebody 300 or 400 years later mentions that this other person had written something. Not a single copy has survived. And yet how much we would love for them to survive. For example, I have read from a number of sources that there were something like 5 different biographies written of Alexander the Great within one person's lifetime of when he actually lived. So that would mean one generation. And they're referenced in various places in other later ancient Greek documents, and yet not a single one of them still survive. And yet this was the most important guy in the world when he was alive. He was bound to rule the world and did a pretty good job of it. And yet we don't have a single document, not just a single autograph, but even a single later manuscript that is a copy of an autograph, no matter how many generations removed, that was written by somebody who lived in the same generation he did. Does anybody have a problem with believing that Alexander the Great not only lived, but conquered most of the Asia Minor and that part of the world? And nobody seems to have a problem with that, even though the documentary evidence is of the very sketchiest kind. And yet, here we are, the picture we have, and again, this has to be just opinion because we don't have anyone that wrote it down back in that day in just so many words. The picture we seem to have is this, based on the few passages we have in the New Testament we looked at last time, and what we know generally from how scribes and the propagation of documents took place in that time, long before copy machines, printing presses, and all that sort of thing. There was a whole class of people known as scribes. These were professional copyists. Now, you didn't have to be a professional to make a copy, but if you wanted a good copy or the best copy, you took it to a scribe. And they would have access either to the original, if that was available to them, or if not that, as good a copy of the original as possible. And then if they were just going to make one copy of it, then they would sit down with it before them, and then they would write based on what was in that original. And some of them did a better job than others of the writing. Some of them did a better job than others of going back and proofreading it. And so we even see that in the Greek manuscripts that exist today. Some of them made a lot of mistakes. There's even places where they actually would go back in and put what amounts to the little housetop right in between a couple of letters, and up in small print just above they'd write a little tiny word, one they left out, because they did that. Or they'd move out into the margin. They followed standard practice for that time. The Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, for the generations they were made in, look just like manuscripts that we have of totally secular writings that have survived from that time. They used the same kind of writing materials. They wrote in the same way, usually in columns that had a set number of letters. That can seem sort of confusing to us because when they wrote all of these were written in what's called uncial Greek, which means all capital letters. And they wrote without breaks between words. And when they got to the end of a line, and they usually had a set pattern, they would have maybe they'd have 20 to 22. That's just an example. Maybe they'd say, I can fit 20 to 22 characters on this line. When I get my 22nd one in, I go down to the next line and put the next letter, even if that's part of the word, without any hyphen or anything like that. And then I just keep writing. And that was standard form for hundreds of years in the Roman world, how Greek and even Latin documents were written. Latin, the language of the Romans themselves. So they followed standard practice. Their interest was the same as the interest of pagans and secular writers, and that was to get out copies of it, not what happened to the original after they had made their copy. Again, to insist we need to have the autographs, as nice as we think that would be, and I think it would be nice, that is an anachronistic way of thinking. That is not the way they thought. They did not put the same kind of value on the original as we do, as long as they were convinced they had an accurate copy. And so they would copy, and then eventually, they didn't have access to the autograph anymore. They live in Egypt, they live in Rome, they live in Gaul, they live in North Africa, at Carthage or something. So they don't have the original, but they've got a good copy. Well, we need more copies of the Gospels. So they take the copies they have, and they copy that. That is the process. And what's sort of amazing to me is where most of the copies we have been found. They weren't found carefully put away in libraries marked, Carthage Church of Christ Library, A.D. 150. They're found in some of the oddest places. There's this place right now that's just been in the last, 100 years since they first discovered it. You can go look it up, and I give you, if you go online to the materials you can access online that I put up there for you, even links that you can go to. A place in southern Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. And I hope that's how it's pronounced. It's spelled I'll have to look every time when I spell it to make sure I got it right. But Oxyrhynchus. They originally started excavating this ruins of this ancient city because it's known that from slightly before the New Testament time up until maybe 600 or 700 A.D., that it was a city with a strong Greek influence in it long after the Greek Empire was gone. And that that in Oxyrhynchus, they had seen from many other references that at Oxyrhynchus in southern Egypt, that they focused on Greek culture. And so you've got these great Greek playwrights and philosophers and so forth, from the golden age of Greece, that wrote all these things that scholars would like to have either more copies of if they can find them, or even just one copy of, because many of them are only mentioned in the writings of others, and we don't actually have copies of any of their writings anymore. So that's why they first went to Oxyrhynchus, and as they were excavating it, guess what? They found nothing. They found the ruins of houses buried under the sand, public buildings, cooking pots, fragments of clothing that people wore, because this is the desert, and so that things don't rot very quickly, especially once they're buried in the sand. But it wasn't until they discovered the city dump that they hit a gold mine. Now, while this stuff was in the city dump, I can only presume that it's essentially for the same reason stuff is in our city dumps today. That people, either of that who own the stuff or people of later generations, says, we don't need this anymore, and so off to the dump it goes. We want the new stuff. And so in the city dump, which they're still excavating, by the way, they have found hundreds and hundreds of portions of classical Greek manuscripts and dozens of Christian Greek manuscripts in the trash. We don't know the reasons why. Maybe they made new copies and the old ones were worn out. I mean, I have sort of it's bound to be just superstition, but I just don't throw away a Bible even after I wear it out. I'm still lugging them around from me. I still have the first Bible I preached out of starting in 1970. The cover's taped to the insides now with black electrical tape, and I haven't actually preached out of it for, almost 40 years now. But I just don't throw them away. But maybe other people don't necessarily think that would be my anachronistic thinking if I tried to force them to think like I do. But here are all these Christian documents from Oxyrhynchus. They're papyrus, almost all of them. And they provide us with some excellent pieces, not whole books necessarily, but pieces of clearly New Testament documents. And they're in a trash dump. Elsewhere in Egypt, and this keeps popping up all the time even now in the news, is in some areas they find that when people died in Egypt, they made a death mask for them. This is just sort of the carry-on from the ancient days of the pharaohs when they had a death mask and the mummification and all. And so they would make a mask that would put over their face, and that mask was many times made out of an ancient form of paper mache. They would wet the papyrus sheets, and they would carefully lay it over the dead person's face in several layers of it, and after they had the shape of their face, put a mask, then it would probably be painted or something. Well, poorer people couldn't afford fresh new papyrus, even though it was much more economical than some other things they could use. It still was expensive, so what they discovered is that they would take discarded or unused written documents and wet those and lay it over their faces, because after all, they're going to paint it after it's all done anyway, and you won't see those letters and words underneath. And it's amazing how many early Christian manuscripts they have found that have been incorporated into death mask in Egypt. But of course, as you can imagine, the tricky part is getting them back out again because they were wet and stuck together with others on top of them and so forth. But they are doing that. And others are found, some of the great manuscripts called the codexes or codices, that means not just single sheets or a few sheets, but actually whole books, a codex, like the Codex Sinaiticus, was found in a monastery in the Sinai Peninsula. And the man who found it, Tischendorf, in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, somewhere in there, he was actually going through looking for manuscripts. And basically the monk said, well, here's what we've got. And they showed him their little library. And there were some interesting things in there, stuff dated back to the 13th century and 14th century, but really nothing different than what he had seen elsewhere. And they let him stay with them. They gave him a room for a few nights. And he got up one morning. This is my understanding of what happened. Got up one morning. It was pretty chilly, so he gets his clothes on and goes down to where a monk was building a fire. And there the monk is. He's got some old book over there, and he's tearing a page out and putting it in the fire. That's his kindling to get the fire started. So Tischendorf moves closer, and the guy's ripping out the pages of what becomes Codex Sinaiticus and burning it in the fire because he sees it of no value. It was in Greek. He didn't speak Greek. He was a monk. He only knew Latin. So it's just an old book to him. Tischendorf, with great effort, finally convinced them to let him have the book or buy it from them instead of them using it to start the fire every morning. This is considered one of the 4 greatest manuscripts of a significant part of the New Testament that we have today. So, there's no predicting where they're going to find these things. It seems clear that the ancients weren't setting them aside just so we could find them. I mean, trash dump, death mask, using for kindling in a fire in a monastery in the Sinai. But that's what we need to be encouraged by, that there's probably still a lot more out there to be found. And it might even be that one day, if God wills, we'll actually find one they will decide is actually an autograph too. Okay. Well, a couple of minutes here. That's what I mean by this last thing, what we don't know yet. You know, this field is just like a lot of science. You know, around 1980, if you did not believe in the Big Bang Theory about the beginning of the universe, you just were on the outs in the scientific community. Even if you were an expert in physics, astrophysics, astronomy, and all that stuff, if you did not believe in the Big Bang Theory, you were out. 25 years later, if you did believe in the Big Bang Theory, you were the dummy. They had moved on to something else. And that's what happens, of course, in many of the sciences, even sometimes in this science. What doesn't change are the facts as we have them. Maybe more are discovered, more manuscripts and things like that. But realizing what some are saying today, maybe 50 years from now, new discoveries will show that many of these criticisms were totally unwarranted. But they'll have new ones by that time. Mm-hmm. But we can have confidence. And of course, we still have more to say about that. Did want to show you this chart. This is actually from an atheist website, or his blog, actually. And this is the one I was telling you about. He says, what's the big deal about the 5,700 manuscripts? Most of them are way after the fact, so why would we make anything of that? And he made this little chart here. And you're not supposed to try to read it exactly, but he's saying in the second century, only a very few. I think he said 2. I think actual experts would say a few more than that, but not many. A few more in the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. Here's 200 line here. Not till you get to the 9th century, you almost reach 200. And of course, most of them are up here in the 11th, 12th, and 13th and 14th centuries, which is a long time, 1,400 years after the autographs. And he says, starting about here, I think he said from here on, those could all just be thrown away. They're worthless. I don't think the experts, even Ehrman, who works on these things, thinks that way. But that's what this guy was saying. He's just making that assertion. But even if that is all we had, just these first few here from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th century. 5th century means up to 499. Even if we just take those, which his numbers don't quite add up. I saw somebody say that's about 280 manuscripts. That is still multiple times over what we have of any other ancient writing. Not even counting how much closer they are to the original than any of those others are. Okay, let's take our break. So.